Johnson-Davies. I would like to ask you some questions, obviously about your translating. You've been translating for many, many, many years. Edward Said has called you the leading Arabic English translator of our time. You've translated also a number of Naguib Mahfouz's novels. So I would first like to start by asking you some questions about your work as a translator and then about Naguib Mahfouz. Let me begin by asking you how you decide which book or which novel to translate. Which one, how do you decide?
Well, I suppose I was very lucky in that I was, Edward Said said I was the leading translator. I think the fact was that in my day I was the only translator. And of course, it was really up to me to choose what I translated. In fact, it wasn't I, it is I who told them what was worth translating. So if I translated something, it was something that I enjoyed reading.
Well, what would you describe, could you be a little more specific when you say it's worth translating? It's just because it reads beautifully, or it's just a great piece of literature, or it's something about Arab culture that needs to be read to a wider world, or?
Well, I felt that very early on, we're now talking of I arrived here in 1945, directly after the war. So really one is talking about a literature which nobody knew about. And this was the attraction for me, that I felt that there was something worthwhile in modern Arabic literature. And even though nobody was paying any attention, it needed attention. And at that time it was very strange. Nowadays you find that there are about, 15 or 20 people who are capable of translating a novel from Arabic into English. In my day there was nobody except myself. So really I was a sort of dictator in the field, which I enjoyed actually. And I also felt that really I was doing something for Egyptian literature, because the Egyptians themselves did nothing at all. For instance, the very first book I did was one by Mahmoud Taymour, who was the great sort of short story writer of his time. And then a very great friend of mine was Yahya Haqqi, and he was a great joker. He also got me out of a lot of trouble once, because there was something written in the paper that I had said about the Egyptian peasants, that they were practically all starving and going around without shoes and so on and so forth, and that they were living a terrible life. And this reached the ears of the king. This place had a king at that time, and he was very upset about this. And so there were suggestions that I should be removed from the country. Well, as I enjoyed living in Egypt and disliked England very much, I went to Yahya and said, look, what can you do about this? I said, all I'm doing is quoting a book by Tawfiq al-Hakim. I may agree with him, but it's not my quote, it's his. And so he went to the owner of the paper and said, would you see this young Englishman? And so I went along to him, all ruffled and talking about that I'd bring an action against him and so on. And of course he laughed in my face. He said, no, you're not going to bring an action against me, you can't bring an action against me. But I tell you what I'll do is just wait a bit, just be patient a while, and I'll write something nice about you. So a fortnight later, suddenly there was a very good piece about Denys Johnson-Davies, who's serving Arabic literature by translating it, etc., etc. And so this is what happened. So I felt that I was really the only one who was interested in modern Arabic literature, and that oddly enough, that the Arabs themselves weren't interested. I mean, I remember saying to Yahya, you know, what I need to do now is a book about modern Arabic literature, or the short story in the Arab world. Oh, he said, that's a very good idea, because he said, you know, there are good writers outside Egypt. So I prepared this book. In the meantime, I left Egypt. And I left Egypt before everybody was thrown out, because everybody from the English section, Nasser didn't like the idea of having English people here. So they were all thrown out, which I think was a pity, because I remember I made £43 a month in those days, which provided very well, provided me a little flat and so on. Just tells you what's happened to the pound in the meantime. And so each time I was living outside Egypt and various other Arab countries, but I would always pass by Egypt, and I'd make a point of seeing Yahya. And the first question was, oh, and Denys, what's happening with your great book of Arabic short stories? So I would say, well, the trouble is I haven't found a publisher for it yet. And then the time came, and this didn't come, can you imagine? I mean, I published the Timur book at my own expense in '46, and the next book of Arabic short stories to be published by me or by anybody was in '67. And this was called Arabic Short Stories, and it was published by Oxford University Press, which is a very prestigious publisher. But they made a condition that the book would only be published if it was introduced by a famous scholar. Well, a person with whom I didn't get on particularly well was, can I remember his name? Tell me his name. He was professor at Cambridge. Anyway, there he was. And so I went, or I wrote to him and said, look, this book isn't going to get published unless it gets an introduction by somebody as well known as yourself. And he very kindly, he wrote back to me and said, look, I know nothing at all about modern Arabic literature. You see, the trouble was nobody was interested. But he said, I'll write something. And so he wrote an introduction, Aubrey, the name. And his name is Aubrey, right. Professor Aubrey.
Now, may I ask you what you like about translating? I mean, were you driven to this, or was it just sort of...
No, I don't like. Let me be frank, let me say, translation is real hard work. It is also not appreciated. So if you get your name on the book anywhere at all, you'll be very lucky. And you can work away at some book. I remember visiting a friend of mine who published a book of Dostoevsky. I think, in fact, the man translated it from the French and not from the Russian. But, I mean, I think it was the brothers Karamazov. And it's an enormous book. And he showed me this with great pride. And I said, and who translated this? Oh, he said, it's a Syrian called Fulan. Oh, I said, where's his name? Oh, no, there's his name. It was, so in tiny little letters was this poor man's name. And I said, but it'd be interesting to know something about him. I mean, if he did translate it from the Russian, how did he learn Russian, etc., etc. But there was no sort of feeling that anything was owed to the translator, I'm afraid. And I think the same really applies today.
Now, would you say that a translator has perhaps a certain style of translation? And would you say that it infringes, it can possibly infringe on the author's literary style? Or is this something that should not actually happen? And if it does, would you say this is to be expected and is possibly part of what you would call a good translation?
Well, I think one of the problems with Arabic is that they are, or were, all using what is in fact a dead language. And I was much against this, and this is one of the subjects of conversation I always had when I met Naguib Mahfouz. His argument was that if because I said, look, you know, I mean, here we are, we're talking together, you the great writer, and yet you're talking to me in colloquial Arabic. Now I'm replying to you in colloquial Arabic because there is a spoken language which differs from the other. But suddenly I open a novel by you and I find that they're all speaking in classical Arabic. And I find this extraordinary. Well, he said, I do this because I want my books to be read throughout the Arab world. And if I put colloquial language, colloquial Egyptian language, it's not going to be understood by, say, Iraqis. And I was very surprised when I did my book on Naguib Mahfouz, because for the first time I really read practically everything he wrote. He admitted in a passage there that in his early days, some of the dialogue which he had given in classical Arabic really didn't go down well.
Now, going back to the quote of Edward Said, I don't know if you care to comment, but why do you think he considered you such a fine translator? I mean, do you consider yourself a fine translator?
Well, I think he was, funnily enough, when he made this remark in an article, I had never met him. I then met him later at a party at the AUC. I think, I mean, the fact was I was practically the only one in the field. And so it was very nice of him to say this about me.
To be modest, perhaps. Do you think there's a lot of talent out there today among Arab writers, more so than maybe perhaps 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Oh, very much so, that's right. I mean, there was really no interest. Well, say when I started, when I arrived here in 45 and I got to know the writers of the time, there were really very few people who were interested in the modern literary movement. I remember somebody, I've forgotten who, made the remark, he said, of course I don't make any money out of my writing because the only people who read me are those who are given books by me. Nobody's, see, because the whole, in fact, I quote this, Rodenbeck wrote a book about his life in Cairo and how he used to come into Cairo by the train each day, and he never saw anybody reading a book. Whereas in England, of course, I mean, people go on long journeys, and what do you do except look out of the window occasionally and read a book?
Now, would you say that I mean, you must have read so many books throughout your life. Would you say there is one book in particular that you enjoyed translating out of all the books that you've translated? One that sticks out? And
well, I suppose, you know, if I was asked, you know, who do you think is the greatest writer? And he doesn't think of himself, or didn't think of himself as a writer, oddly enough, and that is Taib Saleh. I suppose I'm particularly pro him because I spent some of my childhood in the Sudan and like the people very much. And I feel that his work is very simple, very direct, and there's nothing pretentious at all about it. And I feel that, oh, and I think the very first short story he published was in a magazine which I started. My God, I can't remember the name. I started a magazine in Arabic in London, and Taib Saleh and I were sort of vague friends then, and he sent this, it's called Doomat Wad Hamid, the Doom Tree of Wad Hamid, and he sent in this story to me and I published it, and I thought it was an excellent story, and I translated it. And I tried before to have translations by me published in what was then the leading English language magazine of the time, Encounter. And these were all then returned to me, none, even by well-known writers like Yusuf Idris, who was also a friend of mine. But suddenly this Doomat Wad Hamid was accepted by Encounter, and in fact altogether they published 3 stories by Taib Saleh. So I'm a great fan of Taib Saleh, yes.
And maybe this may seem like a redundant question then in that case, would you say that there's an Arab writer that you really enjoy reading in particular? Would he be?
Well, yes, he would be Taib Saleh, I think. But I mean, I think there are other names that have come up in the meantime, and I think somebody like Ibrahim Al Cooney, who was a Libyan writer, I think his writing interests me because I'm just sort of interested in the desert and the Tuareg and things like this.
Now, allow me to move to Naguib Mahfouz. Which of Mahfouz's novels do you prefer?
Well, the trouble is I knew Naguib Mahfouz well, and we used to meet very often. And as I said, the discussion was very often on the question of language. And I remember we both, I think, got on very well, and he was very frank with me. I mean, I remember once when he wrote this book that got him into all the trouble, he said to me, he said, look, Al-Azhar wants to question me about this book. What do you think? What shall I say? So I said, look, you simply say nothing. You're a writer. It's not for you to tell readers what to think about your writing. It's for them to make up their minds. So I would simply refuse to talk about it.
You said once about Naguib Mahfouz. Mahfouz also rendered Arabic literature a great service by developing over the years a form of language in which many of the archaisms and cliches that had become fashionable were discarded. What do you mean by archaisms and cliches? I mean, could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I suppose, well, first of all, classical Arabic is a very rich language, a very old language, a very difficult language, and a large number of writers like to show that they know it very well, and therefore are introducing all sorts of words and phrases which require one to look up in a dictionary. Well, Naguib Mahfouz didn't do this. I mean, one of the advantages about him was that although he refused to use the colloquial language in his dialogue, he also refused to go in for highfalutin Arabic. I mean, so that his Arabic is as near as colloquial or as near as spoken as can be, but it is classical.
What would be the other aspects of Mahfouz's writing that you think made him such a great writer? Was it his characters, his plot, his style? What do you think made him such a great writer?
Well, I think that he dealt with life in a very direct manner. I remember, I can't remember, I'm getting old and I can't remember names of either people or titles of books, but a very early novel of his about this quarter that he enjoyed writing about. And I remember this book. And I, for instance, remember the business of a character there who makes his living out of bringing about in people, say, I mean, he would, for instance, say, cut somebody's leg off or make him blind in one eye in order that he would be a more effective beggar. Which is a terrible thought. But I found this character extraordinary. And in fact, I began translating this book. And I remember once I used to go and visit Tarzan with somebody called Louis Howard, who was a great friend of mine. And I remember mentioning the name Naguib Mahfouz. There were a whole lot of literary people there. And not a soul knew of Naguib Mahfouz. I think, you know, that people really were not taking literature very seriously. And
what year is this?
oh, this was in the 40s, yeah, it would say 47, something like that. I remember mentioning this particular book of Naguib Mahfouz that I was then translating. And I translated a lot of it, and then discarded. I put in a drawer because, you know, when am I going to get it published? And it was then later translated by somebody else and published in Beirut, but not in England. And I think, you know, that the English, they are extraordinary in this way. They have their set ideas, and so people, you know, couldn't sort of bring themselves to think that an Arab, they don't really know anything about Arabs. Where are they? And they're sitting in the desert somewhere, and so on. They couldn't bring themselves to believe that an Arab could be sophisticated. And for instance, Jill Neville, who was the critic for the, I've forgotten, some leading paper in England, very much praised one of Taib Saleh's novels. In fact, I think it won a prize. And I remember going into the leading bookshop in Piccadilly and asking about this book. And the person frowned. Who's the author? So I said, where's he from? Well, I said, actually, he's from Sudan. Oh, no, you will find that down in the basement. So it took a long time for people to get used to the fact that possibly something could come out of the Arab world.
Would you say that there's some other contemporary Arab writers, or one in particular, that can perhaps match to some extent Naguib Mahfouz's pen, or do you think he really was outstanding and unique?
Well, I think he was unique in the amount of effort he put into it all. I mean, he was very organized in everything. He used to go for walks from certain times to certain times, and then he would spend hour after hour after hour writing. And so he was very organized in his life. He produced an enormous amount. I've forgotten. I know when I was asked to do this book about him, I was told that no less than 37 books by him are translated into English. And so I thought, my God, I'm going to have to read through these 37 books. So he took the whole thing very seriously, but without, odd enough, taking himself very seriously. I mean, he was an extremely modest person with a sense of humor and an altogether remarkable character. And I think, was utterly astonished when he won the Nobel Prize.
So that's really how you would describe him as a man, because you yourself just mentioned a while ago you knew him well. How many years did you know him, and is that how you would describe him as a man, organized and modest and a very hard worker?
Well, I suppose I knew him really before he won the Nobel Prize. I knew him for a long time at that time, and he used to go to certain cafes, and I would go to the same cafe, and I would generally find myself alone with him. The trouble is that once somebody becomes famous, everybody wants to be around him, and I didn't find this particularly interesting. So really after the Nobel Prize, I hardly saw Naguib Mahfouz. But we would phone each other up and so on, or rather, it was generally I who phoned him. And I remember I tell the story of, I decided to do, I mean, he wasn't known as a writer of short stories, although I think he has written some excellent short stories, among them Zahab al-Awi, which has found its way into all sorts of collections in English. And I remember ringing him up about a story. And I normally never asked any questions about anything. But with this story, I found myself asking various Egyptian friends, well, what does this mean? And nobody could tell me what it meant. So I thought, really? So in the end, I rang up Naguib Mahfouz, and I said, look, I'm doing this book of short stories by you, and I've come to the end of this story, and it just in my mind doesn't make sense, or I just don't understand it. So he said, okay, read it to me. So I read it to him. No, he said, it doesn't make sense. So he said, let me look up my manuscript of the story. So he looked up in the manuscript. Oh, he said, you're quite right. He said, they left out a line. Now, this is one of the troubles, I think, and I think it exists today among Arab authors, or Arab publishers rather, is that they don't have editors. I think editors are an essential thing. I think sometimes they can be something which puts off a writer. I think it was Jill Neville who told me that she once had an editor who went on and on and on at her, that in the end she just thought to herself, well, that's it, I don't want to write anymore. And you asked me about did I enjoy being a translator? I find translation hard work, and I would have preferred to have been a writer. In my very early days, I wrote 2 novels, and they were both published. They were published under pseudonyms. And then came the time when I wrote a 3rd novel, and by this time I'd gone to Cairo, and of course there was no email in those days, thank God for email. And I used to get these letters from the publisher saying, yes, but we think that the sexy scene on page 100 should be toned down a bit. Okay, right, so I toned down the sexy bit on page so-and-so. And then 3 months later, why does this, that, and the other? Why don't you elaborate on this, and so on? And in the end, I just said, look, let's forget. And I never had trouble to complete the novel. So but it does require somebody in the place, say with the story I'm talking about Naguib Mahfouz, to realize that the end of the story, that a line is missing.
Let me ask you one final question. I mean, since you knew Mahfouz so well, and you probably had also, you were just not talking about literature, but also no doubt about politics. What do you think he would have said about the 25th of January revolution in Egypt, and perhaps, for that matter, the whole Arab world right now that seems to be shifting? Would that have inspired a novel? How do you think he would have reacted to that?
Well, let me mention something before then. I was going to say what a sort of simple and modest man he was, because when the present head of the AUC Press came, I said to him, look, you know, it would do the press a lot of good if you suddenly had a prize in Naguib Mahfouz's name. Oh, he said, Denys, what an excellent idea. Do you think he'd agree? Do you know him? Yes, I said, I know him quite well. Or do you think he'd agree? Yes, I said, you know, he agreed to anything. So we rang up and we got an appointment. We got in his car and went round there. And of course, Naguib Mahfouz said, yes, of course you can use my name and have a prize. And I think this has done a lot of good to Arabic literature, because since then, all sorts of other people have said, my God, why don't we have a prize? And okay, so the prize, I mean, I was rather shocked when Mark Lings, I asked him, I said, how much is the prize going to be? He said, well, $1,000. So I said, you know, that's not a great deal of money. He said, yeah, but it's also going to include a guarantee that it will be published in an English translation. And so I think this is really what started the whole movement of translating Arabic literature into English. And let me say another thing here. You will find that right at the beginning, I refused to cooperate. In fact, I was living in Beirut at the time, and a man turned up in Beirut and said, oh, we would like you to be part of the scheme which is now on for translating the whole works of Naguib Mahfouz. What we do is we get an Arab to do a translation, and then we pass this translation on to an Englishman, and then maybe his rendering on to somebody else. And so, for instance, you will find that there is the book by Naguib Mahfouz, and I've forgotten the name, a very early book, where there are no less than 4 names as translators. Well, my reply was, look, if somebody can write a book, he can also translate a book. I don't think it needs a whole team of people. In fact, just the opposite. You asked now another question.
Yes,
sorry.
Actually, my final question would be really what you think Naguib Mahfouz would have said about the 25th of January revolution.
I always felt that Naguib Mahfouz was not, I suppose that at the time, he was not particularly interested in politics. It's a question I can't, I mean, it's a supposition I can't make as to what his reaction would have been. But I think he would have said, yeah, it's time everybody got on with things and started something anew.
Would there be something else you'd like to add about yourself as a translator, or about your friendship with Naguib Mahfouz, or him as a man? Is there something we left out that you would like to add?
I think I would just like to say that really translators need to be slightly more appreciated than they are. I mean, just recently an edition came out of a novel I'd done by Taib Saleh, and there is Taib Saleh's name on the cover and the name of somebody who writes the introduction, but not my name. And I mean, after all, if you are reading a translation, you are reading the translator's words. And I think, you know, this should be recognized. I was very fed up when I saw this, that there was merely the name of somebody who'd done an introduction. I thought, you know, anybody can do an introduction. But in fact, I was very pleased in that he said, I have no comment to make about the exquisite introduction, exquisite translation by so-and-so. So I then forgave him for that. But it's not something that I would set out to be, quite frankly, a translator. I mean, if I had talent, I would prefer to be a writer, yes.
You mentioned just now exquisite translation. So what would you then consider to be a good translation? If you're reading a book and you say, oh, this is a wonderful translation, you haven't necessarily read it in the original language, but you're reading a translation and you feel that this is really well translated, how would you describe a good translation, or what makes a good translation?
I think this is a very difficult question to answer, because I think there are all sorts of views about translation. One view is that the translation should somehow indicate that it is in fact a translation and is not by the translator himself. I think that very often the writer writes in such a style that it is very difficult for the translator to imitate this style in a completely different language. I think these are just very difficult decisions that a translator has to make.
Well, I guess on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for this interview. Thank you.
Thank you.